I'm Sarah Wilson, and you're listening to the Roots and All Budcast. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Budcast. This is part 2 of the Iain Tolhurst talk that he gave at the VegFest in Brighton. He talks more about the idea of stock-free farming and why we should be interested in doing it. And he gives kind of good reasons for why we should do it. And he also talks about the interesting question that a lot of people get asked, especially if they're vegan, which is what happens to the animals if everybody turns vegan. And he does address that. I'm not sure he's got a solution to it per se, but he does talk about it, and at least he's kind of talking about these topics head on. If you're not vegan and you're not interested in farming, but you are interested in where your food comes from and you're also a gardener, I think this episode is going to be really relevant to you. So give it a go, and I hope you enjoy it.
So stock-free organic standards were set up in 2005, I think. It's really a very specific standard to ensure that farmers and growers are completely stock-free. It is certifiable. We are certified to do this, and it's operated by the Soil Association doing inspection. But the actual standards were set up by the Vegan Organic Network, and I worked with several other people on this standards. We were the first ever in the world to have such a standard. And it really is about excluding livestock from the farm. We don't bring animal manures in, we don't do any killing of animals, we don't do any blood sports, obviously. We don't produce food for livestock, so we're not able to grow cereals, for example, to feed to animals. That wouldn't be allowed. And the idea really is to try and make the farmers as near self-sufficient as possible in terms of fertility. So there's no animal products used at all. And why would we want to go stock-free? Well, most organic farms, particularly vegetable farms, would be bringing manure from somewhere else. And we call these ghost acres. It's somebody else's land that you're using to support your fertility. And there's an ethical question around that. You know, why would we be importing somebody else's fertility when we should really be using our own? And that's the question, because if everybody was to go organic, there wouldn't be enough manure around to make it work. There would be a demand for more livestock rather than less livestock. So if we're going to gradually reduce livestock production in the world, and I think almost everybody agrees that that is necessary. It's taken a long time for people to come up with that idea, but most people have a problem disputing that theory that we need to reduce livestock. We have to get fertility from somewhere. If it doesn't come from animals, it has to come from somewhere else. So we actually develop our own fertility cycles within the farm. So we're not dependent on somebody else's land, which we import. It's the nearest thing you can get to a closed farm system, and that's where we're really aiming to go. And it's productive. We produce, very good yields of vegetables on land which is not generally considered to be vegetable production land. It has a very low carbon footprint, because once you start excluding animal manures, you exclude a whole lot of carbon as well, which you would have to otherwise pay for. There's no reliance on animal culture. We don't need livestock farms in order to survive and grow crops. And it avoids the problems of sourcing inputs, because inputs to any farm, any input to a farm has a cost. It has an environmental cost, has an economic cost, and it has a cultural cost as well. So we've excluded as much as possible from importation to the farm. We rely a lot on biodiversity. Biodiversity is the driver of the farm. Everything we do on the farm is really about encouraging and developing biological systems. That's what we do. We actually develop a biological system, and we grow vegetables within that. And the vegetables are a byproduct of the biodiversity. The biodiversity comes first. The vegetables fit in around that rather than the other way around. So it's very much about working for us and the farm and the environment. And it's a whole farm system. So everything on the farm is considered as a whole. We don't look at independent components on the farm, the soil, green manures, rotation, everything becomes part of the whole. Right, the problem. In terms of livestock on farm, my real awakening to this was back in 1984, when I heard somehow through the news that during the Ethiopian famine, and this was a horrible event which was widely publicized. People were dying, by the second in Ethiopia, and this country was importing cereals from Ethiopia at that time. And this suddenly, to me, this really shook me badly. Why are we importing cereals to feed our cows, and people in Ethiopia are dying of famine. And this, to me, was the kind of the awakening of what was going on. And I hadn't really considered the global impact of agriculture in anything like this detail until this happened. So this was a big awakening for me. I mean, most people ignored it. I mean, the media ignored it. It was, if this happened today, it would be all over the media. But in those days, it wasn't considered to be a problem. You could carry on. You could carry on importing food from countries and let people die. That was kind of how things happened. And then there's the scandals of stolen acres. I've already pointed out, if you farm organically or even conventionally and you bring manure from somewhere else, you are stealing somebody else's land to maintain your productivity. And then there's, feeding the world. One of the questions I often get asked is, how are you going to manage to feed the world on this system? Well, actually, we're not actually managing to feed the world anyway at the moment. Feeding the world is not about food. Feeding the world is about politics. If you've got money, you don't go hungry, no matter where you live. It's not about the lack of food. There's plenty of food around. Half of it gets thrown away anyway. It's about the politics of food. So we don't have a problem with feeding the world. We certainly shouldn't have a problem with feeding the UK. But this country is only 50% self-sufficient in food. We import 50% of our food. It's a horrendous amount. During the war years, when arguably people were better fed than they've ever been since, we only imported something like 5% of our food. We lived on 95% own production, and we did that. We got to that point within 2 years. From 1938 to 1940, we scaled our agriculture up to such a point where we took nearly all the livestock out, improved the agricultural system by growing many more vegetables and many more cereals and feeding people those crops. And everybody was better fed. They didn't like it because they didn't have much meat or eggs, but they were much better fed. And we managed to feed everybody without importation. But nowadays, we're back to importation because people's demands are so much higher. People want Calabrese all year round. They want strawberries in the middle of winter. Things which actually are not technically possible in this country, even with modern methods. So we have to import, and it's really about people's expectations. So there's no shortage of food around. It's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not enough land for primary food production. Well, there is actually. If you were to reduce, just in UK, if you were to reduce the livestock element of food production by around 50%, you would release enough land to feed everybody. So you wouldn't even have to cut out animal production completely. You just cut down by 50% and stop feeding cereal-based products. So there is plenty of land. There's no shortage of land. And even in a small country such as ours, if people's diets were to change dramatically, and that really means they have to cut out a lot of meat and dairy products, then there would be enough land to feed everybody. And the carbon footprint. Animal agriculture makes a huge demand on carbon in terms of the emissions, because of the methane and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, but also because the systems, the industrial systems that go into supporting that livestock farming. We've got buildings, we've got lorries, we've got transport, we've got ships, we've got abattoirs, we've got processing, we've got all that stuff which has a huge carbon footprint. And then there's greenhouse gases. I'll go more into that in a minute. Pork and poultry. Pork and poultry and dairy actually, the real offenders. They actually use far more of the world's agricultural resources than any other livestock farming. They eat a lot, they eat a lot of cereals. The reason that during the war, if you were on a food ration and everybody was rationed, you only got 1 egg a week, was because eggs use a huge amount of cereal to produce. Chickens don't normally lay eggs unless you feed them huge amounts of cereal. So pork and poultry and dairy are huge consumers, and even if this was cut down by a percentage, it would make a big difference to the whole situation. And then consumers' expectations about what they expect to eat. People are increasingly wanting to eat more of an animal-based diet because they tend to feel that is a sign of wealth and affluence. And this, as we know, is not very good for the planet. I'm going to bore you with some graphs now, and some bar graphs. This is really about the contribution that agriculture makes to greenhouse gases. And you can kind of read it for yourself, really. But fertilizers don't actually add that much. It's significant, but it's quite a small amount. The biggest factor in terms of, the pale blue is carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and the dark blue is carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and the pale blue is global greenhouse gas emissions, percentage of. Now, the big one really is the land conversion to agriculture. This takes up produces a lot of carbon and a lot of greenhouse gases, because you're taking out tropical rainforest, you're losing forest, and a lot of this forest is going into producing soya, which goes into the animal feed. Something like 85% of all the soya grown in the world goes to feed animals. It doesn't feed people, it goes to animals. So it has a huge effect on the climate change. And direct methane and nitrous oxide, which comes from animals farting and belching, and land tillage also makes up a significant amount. I mean, the total bill in terms of the percentage of greenhouse gases contributed by agriculture comes to 30%. It's a big figure. So, agriculture has a big role to play in terms of mitigating climate change. Methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, these are all the main emitters from agriculture and other industries as well. Carbon dioxide is actually not much in terms of the actual pollutant effect. The big one is nitrous oxide and methane. And this is where animals come in, because they produce a lot of both of these things. The culprits really, the main culprits are livestock, fertilizer. I mean, the production of fertilizer uses a lot of electricity, it uses a lot of carbon, and then that gets dissipated into the environment. So, it's a net use of carbon. The use of fossil fuels, which goes into making fertilizers, and fossil fuels for machinery, for equipment, and primarily for lots of all the chemical products are made using fossil fuel. Soil disturbance, every time you turn ground over, you can release carbon. If you do it badly, you do it wrongly, the wrong time of year, you can put huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Even organic farmers can do this badly. If you go out and plough a field in November and leave it all winter long with nothing on it, you have a huge loss of carbon and nitrogen. So you're increasing the carbon content of the air, you're also increasing nitrous oxide content in the air. So soil disturbance can be really damaging. And this is why on our farm and other farmers who are concerned about these things, they have a completely different approach to farm tillage of soil. And then changes in land management. As soon as you start taking trees out and burning them, you're losing huge amounts of carbon. And also the soil then becomes very, very vulnerable to damage and erosion and loss of further carbon. So these are the main culprits. But animals figure quite highly in this. I mean, animals are as bad as transport. In fact, I think they're worse than transport. Of the entire land surface area, this is not the whole, it's the farmed land surface of the area. 30% goes to arable production, 33% goes to arable production for feed. If you look around the UK, every 100 acres of cereals you see, almost 70 acres is grown for livestock. Only 30 acres goes to people. And of that 30 acres, most of that goes for biscuits and cereals. It doesn't go into bread. The amount of land you need to grow bread to feed the UK is tiny. So most cereals in the UK, the majority of cereals in the UK, are going directly to livestock, and there's a huge loss in that. It involves production of 18% of all greenhouse gases. 80% of agricultural emissions come from livestock. So if you look at all the rest of agriculture put together, it only amounts to 20% of the production of greenhouse gases. So all the cereals, all the fruit, all the vegetables has a much smaller percentage of greenhouse gas emission than agriculture from livestock. And the increased prosperity of people has led to the higher demand for animal products. I mean, we see what's going on in China at the moment, where 30 years ago, China was largely a vegetarian population, and that's changed dramatically in just one generation, when suddenly huge numbers of people want to consume in the way that people in this country and America consume. The use of fertilizer and agrochemicals, this uses oil, it emits nitrous oxide, it's damaging to the environment in many ways. It damages the soil biological systems. Every time you put nitrogen fertilizer on the soil, you deplete the natural fungi and biological element of the soil, which means you have to put more on to get the same effect. Nitrogen fertilizer is still widely used, despite the fact it's now 5 or 6 times more expensive than it was 15 years ago. Food hasn't gone up at all in that time. It's still used because the result often is worth the money that farmers will pay. And